In the first video of Chapter 5, we ended up talking about the year of divide, which was 1991, and we talked about how trade improved after this period. Well, in this next section, we're going to go back a little bit and talk about why trade before 1991, in fact 1990 and prior to that, was so poor. Well, it has to do with India's inward-looking trade strategy at the time. We're going to talk about something known as import substitution. All right, so let's begin. So we're talking about India's inward-looking trade strategy, and at the beginning of independence, there's a practice of domestic trade which the Indian government exercised exclusively. And what they did was they tried to impose restrictions on imports coming from other countries. So they taxed goods from Japan, China, Pakistan, any other trading partners at a very, very high rate. So if you wanted to sell your goods domestically in India, you had to pay a 10% import tax on those goods. And what that was designed to do was to protect Indian producers so that they could sell their goods more cheaply domestically. So that process in and of itself will lead to a higher level of domestic production and limited foreign imports because they're far more expensive than the domestic products. In fact, sometimes the taxes are not even 10%. In Japan, you probably noticed there's very limited access to rice not produced in Japan. Well, that's because as of 2017, the import tax for rice is at an astounding 778%. And that's the reason why you don't find any foreign rice in Japanese stores. So what that does is that leads to only domestic production. Well, Japan, let's go back to Japan. You notice there's only Japanese rice everywhere. By implementing such a system, it leads us to only domestic production. And as a result, this is known as an inward-looking trade strategy. So in this chapter, before we look at into what's good and what's bad and why this is right or wrong, we're going to take a look at two more minor issues. The first is export promotion. Well, the idea of export promotion is when we want to earn foreign exchange by producing goods that we intend to export internationally and sell in the international market. The second one is import substitution, which I've already briefly mentioned. It is designed to produce goods domestically, meaning that we don't need to import goods from the rest of the world. Now, one of the advantages of this is that it allows us to save our foreign exchange reserves. Okay, so now that you know what these two concepts mean, let's move on into what are the benefits and what are the costs of inward-looking trade. So firstly, we're going to talk about the three benefits. First, the high rate of industrial growth. Secondly, diversification of industrial growth. Secondly, diversification of industrial growth. And thirdly, the opportunities of investment. With regards to the high rate of industrial growth, well, because we're not importing anything, we need to satisfy our domestic needs with domestic production. And as a result of that, in India, from 1951 to 1991, GDP increased from 12% to 25%. And a significant portion of that growth was entirely due to industrial sector production. Secondly, the diversification of industrial growth. Because we're not importing a wide variety of goods from the international market, we need to produce a wide variety of goods domestically. And as a result, domestic production is no longer confined to textiles and jute. It included a wide variety of products, and that means there was diversification. And finally, the opportunities of investment. Well, small-scale industry opportunities opened aplenty because now we need to produce everything that our society needs internally. So whatever we were getting from China or America or anywhere from Europe, all of that is basically cut off from us because we're not importing them because of the high tax rate. So we need to make them domestically. So that means people now have new opportunities to create goods which will be consumed domestically. So these are all benefits, right? So the high rate of growth, the diversification of growth, and these opportunities to invest. However, on the opposite side, what do we have? Well, the costs here are firstly, the growth of an inefficient public monopoly. Firstly, the growth of inefficient public monopolies. Secondly, the lack of competition because the borders have been restricted, which means a lack of modernization. Thirdly, the indiscriminate spread of the public sector enterprise. And finally, economically unviable state enterprise. So let's take a quick look at these. The first one, the growth of inefficient public monopolies. Well, because goods were imported in the past and we put a high import rate, or sometimes we even block the trade, there are some industries which basically can't be started unless the government invests in them because they're just too expensive to start up. For instance, telecommunications. And as a result, the government maintained a monopoly in telecommunications in India until 1990. And that's why costs were high, systems were poor, and the infrastructure was severely lacking. Secondly, the lack of competition implies a lack of modernization. Well, this is basically a no-brainer if you look at India. The lack of development of the domestic car industry, the lack of development in any kind of advanced production relating to transportation was completely unheard of in India. And it's because there were no competitive forces to drive growth in those sectors. And as a result, we don't need to modernize. If I don't have any competitors competing against me, making better products, there's no reason for me to improve the quality of my products because I know I will never lose my market share. Thirdly, the indiscriminate spread of public sector enterprises. Well, between 1950 and 1980, public sector undertakings skyrocketed. So much so that the government was probably the largest player in the market in almost every sector. And that is probably the worst thing we could have because the government inefficiently allocates the vast majority of its resources. Finally, this may be acceptable when we're talking about telecommunications and transportation. However, it's not acceptable when we're talking about consumables like bread and shoes. And that's exactly what was going on in India. And finally, economically unviable state enterprises. Well, what this means is if a company was operating in the private sector and it was losing money, it would be forced to shut down because of bankruptcy. However, in India or in any socialist society, when the government is too heavily involved, there's no fear of losing money because the money behind the corporations are provided by the government, and oftentimes not operating at a profit is entirely possible. In fact, it's more than probable, and that means a lot of inefficiency. So, what you've seen here is until 1990, although there were some benefits to inward-looking trade, which allowed India to develop a certain quality of life and set up its industrial sector, the costs far outweighed the benefits, and India needed to change the way they thought about running their economy. And as a result, 1991, a year of divide, is very, very important in the historical context of what India has done.